Thanks so much, and thank you also to ACM for hosting this wonderful symposium. I'd like to mention my name is Koetke, and last fall I went on the Biology in South India program through St. Olaf College. This is an independent program in which the students have two research projects, and my first one, I studied Malabar gray hornbill in fragmented habitat. So first, a little bit of context. We spent our semester in South India in the state of Tamil Nadu, which is this orange state down here. And my first project was in the Western Ghats, which is a mountain range running up the west side of the Indian Peninsula. I lived in the Koetke Hill Station, which is in the Palmy Hills over here. It's a branch of the Western Ghats. And one thing that really interested me about doing biology research in the Western Ghats is that it is a biodiversity hotspot, meaning it is one of 25 biologically rich areas in the world which has lost at least 70% of its natural habitat. This is seen in these top two photos. The two major issues that I got the chance to observe that was creating this habitat loss in the Palmy Hills is, on the left, invasive species. Most of those trees that you see are eucalyptus trees, which are an exotic species and very invasive in many areas, including the Palmy Hills. The other is farming. On the right, you can see an example of terrace farming, which is very common in the mountains. But this changes not only the species composition of the plants in the area, but the landscape as a whole, as you can see by the steps in the earth that they create there. The rainforests in the Palmy Hills have a history, as with many other rainforests, of, like I mentioned, habitat loss and fragmentation. And this fragmentation creates an edge effect, which increases the anthropogenic effects on the wildlife in surrounding native areas. They are more susceptible to invasive species, introduced predators, pollution, and erosion, among many other effects. So I worked with the Palmy Hills Conservation Council, which is a wonderful organization working on several conservation-related projects in the Palmy Hills. Some examples include water quality, conserving wetlands, and conserving wildlife and the Palmy Hills natural ecosystem. So one project in particular that they were working on, which struck my interest, was a hornbill project, as they called it. They are working to conserve the natural habitat of the Malabar gray hornbill by growing in their nurseries seedlings of common crops of the local farmers and seedlings of the natural fruit trees that the hornbills rely on. And then they'll give some seedlings of each to the farmers to incentivize them to grow more of the native tree species. So a little bit of background on the hornbills. I studied two aspects of their behavior, their food selection and nest selection. And they rely on fruit trees. The three main fruits that they eat in the top three photos there are fig, jamun, and silk cotton. And for their nest selection, they rely on the old growth forests because they nest in tree cavities, but they do not excavate their own cavities for their nests. They may rely on other species to excavate the cavities, and then they abandon them, and the hornbills then take over. But more often, they'll use cavities that have resulted from branches falling off the trees in storms. And this really occurs mostly in old growth forests, not on the farms with the exotic trees that are all new growth. So I started out, that's the Malabar gray hornbill. It's beautiful in my opinion. I started out with some bird surveys to try and see which trees they used for resting, feeding, and nesting. So I did a couple weeks of bird watching, and I did point counts in which I sat in one location for a couple hours, and I would watch and listen for hornbills. And I also did line transects, in which I walked a designated path, again, looking and listening for hornbills. Since they are such a threatened species, I did not see as many as I had hoped, and I also did not observe any of the feeding or nesting behaviors, but my results do suggest that they tend to rest, when I found them, in the fruit trees that they rely on for feeding, and also trees that are thicker. Lots of times they were covered in vines, making them more dense, so they could hide from predators or other reasons. But again, these are rarely found on farms. And I was thinking about this aspect of the fragmentation. I decided to augment these results with some interviews of local farmers. So through a translator, I asked the local farmers about their farms, some of their characteristics, including which kinds of trees and if they have any native tree species on their farms. I also asked them about their knowledge of the hornbill and their opinion of hornbill conservation. And one of the results that I found is that unfortunately most of the farmers said that they have few to zero of the fruit tree species that the hornbills rely upon. So this increases the habitat fragmentation by limiting their feeding and nesting availability in these areas. But furthermore, some of my results led to some cultural insights, which I would like to share with you. So first, and this was surprising to PHCC, which is the Colony Hills Conservation Council, is that only 12.5% of the farmers that I interviewed even knew of the presence of hornbills. And these are people that have been living in this area for their entire life. And I showed them pictures and they have never seen it, they've never heard of it, they don't know anything. And of the 12.5% of farmers that do know of the hornbills, there was a moderate knowledge of their feeding and nesting habits. So this really impacted me in my ability to share with this Conservation Council some information that they don't know. It taught me that my studies of wildlife can have real life outcomes and can help in the conservation of such threatened species. But the second result, which I found inspiring, was that almost all of the farmers, regardless of their knowledge of hornbills, had a favorable view of their conservation. They gave reasons such as increasing ecotourism or just their intrinsic value of wildlife. And so I kind of want to conclude this with the fact that educating these farmers would not only benefit the conservation efforts of PHCC, but allow the farmers to see both sides and to balance their economic profit with their environmental impact.